you for watching. I'll be giving a brief talk about a core question that runs through my research, which is what enables humans to do language. Now we can identify at least three capacities and or processes that underpin this ability, which are social cognition, social interaction, and cultural evolution. And each of these phenomena have been studied extensively in isolation from each other. But what I do in my research is to bring them into conversation with each other to reveal the complex dynamics that lie at their interface. To give a little bit of background, a lot of research has been done over the past couple of decades into the process by which language evolves, which is the process of cultural evolution, because the language evolves as it is transmitted from generation to generation through learning. And this research, using both computational models and laboratory experiments with human participants, has shown that we can explain certain properties that we find in actual natural languages across the world as a result of the cultural evolution of language and the constraints and pressures that it brings along with it. However, this research, using computational models and lab experiments, abstract away from certain features of natural language use and natural language learning that, if we incorporate those features, change the dynamics of this process. To give an example, it is likely that as our hominin ancestors first had a language emerge and evolve, that fed back into their cognition in certain ways. Because once we have language at our disposal, that allows us to express what is on our mind and also massively expands the possibilities for transmitting our own knowledge and skills to others, including future generations. So it also expands the possibility for cultural evolution. To give a specific example of a hypothesis based on this idea, experimental psychologist Cecilia Hayes has argued that mind reading, also known as theory of mind, is a cognitive gadget, which means it has evolved through cultural evolution rather than biological evolution. And in this synthesis paper, we show a process by which by which mind reading could have become such a cognitive gadget. We show, using agent-based models, that as a language emerges in a population of agents and as it evolves, this can gradually improve agents' ability to learn about others' minds, and therefore that language and mind reading can co-evolve through cultural evolution. To give another example of an aspect of natural language use that is very often, if not always, left out of models of language use and the cultural evolution of language, is the interactive nature of language use. Communication is not a one-shot event. It doesn't consist of a producer producing an utterance and a receiver then just having to deal with whatever they get. Rather, it is always a collaborative effort between multiple individuals who take turns in a conversation. If we put this all together, we can imagine that complex dynamics emerge, and I use computational modeling to tackle challenging questions about this interplay, and I combine that modeling with a thoroughly interdisciplinary mindset. In this talk, I will give you 3 examples of concrete projects in which I do just that. To begin with this project, which is joint work with Mark Dingemans, where we ask how the fact that natural language use happens in noisy circumstances affects the cultural evolution of language and specifically the emergence of compositional structure. So we know that natural language use happens in noisy and messy circumstances, and luckily natural languages across the world have a shared system for overcoming potential breakdowns in communication, and that system is known as other-initiated repair. Now imagine someone says this sentence, "Sibby's sister had a baby boy." I can respond by saying, "huh?" which is an open request, the first type of repair initiator in this system of other-initiated repair. And what I do by using an open request is I indicate that I had trouble understanding that sentence, but I do not specify which part of the sentence caused my trouble in understanding. So the most common response to an open request is to simply repeat the entire original utterance. We can contrast this with a repair initiator like who, which is the second type of repair initiator, which is a restricted request because I ask for clarification about a specific part of the sentence. Here's another example of a restricted request. The third type of repair initiator, which completes the system of other initiated repair, is the restricted offer, where I offer a candidate understanding of a specific part of the sentence, and the producer of the sentence can then either confirm or disconfirm that candidate understanding. Here's another example. And what we see if we put this whole system of other-initiated repair together is that this phenomenon of repair can act as a sort of searchlight. It can highlight different parts of a sentence and thereby expose the compositional grammatical structure of a sentence. Now, given that around half of the interactions that infants initiate feature some form of repair, it has been argued that repair helps early learners break into morphosyntax, so it helps reveal to them the grammatical structure of their language. And we asked what effect this could have on the emergence of compositional structure. Now, natural languages that we find in humans are always compositional in nature, which means that the meaning of a sentence as a whole is a function of the meaning of the parts of the sentence and the way in which those parts are combined. And this is different from the communication systems we find in other animals, which are holistic in nature, which means that utterances do not have internal structure. There's no sense in which a part of an utterance maps onto a part of a meaning, but rather these mappings are holistic. And what we realized is that these different language types have different affordances when it comes to repair. So if you have a compositional system, this allows you to do such a thing as use a restricted repair initiator, because part of an utterance has meaning to it. So even if only part of an utterance is obscured, you can still discern the meaning of the rest of the utterance. Whereas if you have a holistic system, this is not possible. So agents who have a holistic system are forced to use open repair initiators. And empirical research has shown that restricted repair is more efficient than open repair. Now, existing models have already looked into the emergence of compositional structure using the iterated learning paradigm, whereby a generation of agents who each have a language in their mind produce data that is then transmitted to a next generation. And what we did is we took these existing models and added in two features. On the one hand, the presence of noise, and on the other hand, the possibility of doing repair. Now, what we see if we add noise is that whether or not a given generation of agents uses repair in their interactions determines the quality of the data that is passed on to the next generation. And what we did in our model is to differ a little from previous models of the emergence of compositionality, which have explained compositionality as a result of the trade-off between two pressures. On the one hand, expressivity, and on the other hand, learnability, because compositional structure turns out to be the most compressible, easy to represent system for nevertheless expressing all possible meanings. We decided to do away with that explicit learnability pressure and instead look at what we get if we only have this presence of noise in combination with the possibility of doing repair and the way in which that affects the data that gets transmitted to future generations. So in our model, we only have two pressures that interact with each other in communication, which are a pressure for mutual understanding, which consists of speakers trying to avoid ambiguity and listeners trying to reach a unique interpretation using repair if they have to, with a pressure for minimal effort, which means that agents are more likely to initiate repair when it is less costly. And we assume, based on empirical research, that restricted requests are less costly, so more efficient to do than open requests. And again, more repair means better data for learners. Now let's see what happens if we run simulations with this model. If we look at the effect of only these two pressures in isolation, we see that the proportion with which compositional language types emerge in the population is no different from the kind of baseline proportion ratio that it has in the possibility space of possible languages. But if we combine the two pressures, then we see that the proportion of compositional languages increases. And that is because agents who use a compositional language use repair more often because they can do it more efficiently, and therefore the quality of the data being transmitted to future generations is better, and those agents are better able to infer the language of their cultural parents. So we can see a runaway feedback loop happening between compositionality and efficient use of repair. So to conclude, this project shows that repair likely plays a role in locking in compositional structure both in language development and over cultural evolutionary time. Now, at this point in my talk, I run into a little bit of a dilemma because I would love to tell you more about this project which focuses on language use and specifically how social cognition and social interaction trade off with each other, or rather complement each other. This project was beautifully carried out by Jacqueline van Arkel, an MSc student who I co-supervised with Mark Blokpoel and Mark Dingemanse. But in the interest of time, I will only very briefly tell you what we did and what we found. So what we did is we took an existing model of pragmatic reasoning in communication, the Rational Speech Act framework, which models the process by which we take into account our interlocutor when producing and interpreting utterances, for instance, to resolve potential ambiguity. And we use computational complexity analysis to kind of expose an Achilles heel of this model, which is that this type of recursive reasoning that is involved very quickly becomes very computationally costly. And we contrasted this model with a simple model of interactive agents who do not have these sophisticated pragmatic reasoning abilities, but do have the possibility to use other-initiated repair. And we showed that these agents can reach similar levels of communicative success at a much lower computational cost. So, to sum up, we show that a simple form of other-initiated repair can ease the computational burden of pragmatic reasoning. Again, showing that interaction actually can solve certain theoretical obstacles that we find in existing models of language use and language evolution. Now, for further details, I refer you to the conference proceedings paper that came out of this project, and of course, the code and the data are also openly shared. And that brings me to my final and third project that I want to briefly tell you about, which approaches this question of what constrains the cultural evolution of language from yet another angle, which is the angle of computational tractability. Because if a model of cognition or a model of evolution is to be plausible, it has to be tractable, which means that it has to be doable with limited computational power and time resources. Now, I'm by no means an expert in this field of computational complexity, so this is very much a team science project with collaborators distributed over different institutes. And what we did is we took a class of models that is widely used in the field of cultural evolution of language, the iterated Bayesian language learning model, and we observed that these models always use lexicons, languages that are very much toy scale, often consisting of at most like 3 reference and 3 signals, not many more than that. That makes sense because these models assume Bayesian inference as a model of learning, and Bayesian inference involves considering the entire hypothesis space of all possible languages whenever an agent tries to infer a language from the data they observed. And this space of possible languages becomes very large very quickly. However, this has important implications for theory development, because what we want to do as a field is to have a theory captured by a model that explains a real-world phenomenon. Now, what has been done already is to capture the properties we see on the ecological scale in real-world languages in laboratory experiments with human participants. The toy models that are used, computational models, explain these toy-scale laboratory findings. But the crucial question, if we want to close this cycle, is whether or not our toy models scale to the ecological size of actual human vocabularies, which are tens of thousands of words. And what we show in this CogSci paper is that the toy models are intractable, and therefore also the theory that they capture is intractable as well, which means that we do not yet have a sufficient plausible explanation of the real-world phenomenon. Luckily, not all is lost, because revealing such tractability issues is an important step towards identifying plausible constraints. We can use parameterized tractability analysis to identify constraints that could make these models tractable. And with that, I'd like to end. To conclude, I've shown how I use computational cognitive modeling together with a thoroughly interdisciplinary mindset to expose theoretical obstacles in models that aim to explain what enables humans to do language, and where possible, I try to offer solutions to those obstacles. Thank you for watching.